Imagine just one day, June 20th, 2025. What if we told you that those 24 hours gave us this incredible, sometimes quite sobering snapshot of a world changing really fast? How much can actually happen, across the whole globe in just one single day? Well, that's exactly what we're doing today. We've gathered a whole stack of recent sources, your articles, research notes, and we're going to distill the most important bits of knowledge, the real insights from this, well, incredibly packed day. The idea is to give you a shortcut, help you get informed quickly, find some surprising facts, and really grasp what matters in all these developments.
Yeah, and when you start digging into June 20th, the sources really paint a picture. It's a day marked by some serious global tensions, big shifts in domestic policy right here in the U.S., growing environmental pressures, but also, interestingly, some scientific breakthroughs too. And what's fascinating is how these things, which might seem totally separate, actually link up. They're interconnected in ways that give you a much richer understanding of where things stand.
Okay, let's jump right in then. The most immediate flashpoint seems to be the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. Our sources show June 20th is a really critical moment.
Right.
It seems to have been reignited by Israel's unprovoked attack back on June 12th. And that directly led to these huge protests across Iran on the 20th. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people on the streets, right?
Yeah.
Protesting the attacks and what they saw as U.S. intervention.
Yeah, massive turnouts. And meanwhile, diplomatic talks in Geneva involving Iran, France, Germany, the UK, they just fizzled out. No breakthrough at all.
And the human cost. It's staggering. The sources mentioned at least 639 killed, over 1,200 wounded, including the poet Parni Abbasi, which is just tragic.
It really is.
So given those numbers, the failed diplomacy, what's the deeper story here about U.S. involvement, particularly on that day?
Well, the U.S. angle is definitely crucial. Sources say President Trump announced he'd decide within 2 weeks whether the U.S. would join Israel in attacking Iran. He even issued this ultimate ultimatum to Tehran, which is pretty striking, especially when you consider the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, had just reiterated there was still no proof Iran was actually building a nuclear weapon.
Wow. So that raises huge questions, doesn't it, about potentially bypassing Congress for military action?
Exactly. Big constitutional questions there. And the immediate fallout was already visible, Iranians fleeing, protests erupting globally. The economic hit was real, too. Brent, crude oil prices jumped, 11%?
Yeah.
Up near $77 a barrel.
Yeah, I saw that.
And the Federal Reserve even had to adjust its economic outlook, specifically because of these geopolitical risks. So, if this escalates further, we're not just talking about a wider war in the region, which is bad enough, but something that could seriously destabilize global energy supplies.
Right. And while all that was happening, June 20th also saw movement in other conflict zones. Kind of a mixed bag, really. There was this provisional peace agreement between the DRC, or Democratic Republic of Congo, and Rwanda. The U.S. and Qatar helped mediate that. The aim was disarming M23 fighters, bringing in investment to that mineral-rich area. Is that a genuine step forward, or?
Well, it offers a glimmer of hope, maybe.
Right.
Disarming fighters, investment, that sounds good. But the sources really emphasize the skepticism around it actually working. Implementation is everything. Plus, there are still loud calls for accountability for past atrocities. So it feels more like a tentative step, not quite a solid resolution yet.
Okay.
And then you look elsewhere. The global march to Gaza, it was blocked. Egyptian authorities stopped activists, including the Sumud convoy, from even reaching the Rafah border crossing.
So still incredibly difficult for humanitarian aid to get through.
Exactly. It highlights those ongoing challenges. And then in Ukraine, you had Russian President Putin saying, the whole of Ukraine is ours in theory, and signaling plans to take Sumy. Fighting had flared up again there.
So aggression continuing even as diplomatic efforts were happening elsewhere. It's a complex picture.
A very stark reminder, yeah.
How did global leaders try to manage all this? The G7 summit had just finished, right?
Right. It wrapped up in Kananaskis, Canada, just a few days before, June 16, 17. They talked inflation, supply chains, the war in Ukraine, pressure from China, all the big topics.
Yeah.
And analysts, they generally praised the language in the final statement, called it robust.
There's always a but, isn't there?
Well, yeah, the but was about the G7's actual ability to drive consensus in what people are calling this fracturing multipolar era.
Yeah.
Especially with the U.S. having some pretty different policies on things like climate and trade compared to others, achieving real unified global action, that remains a huge challenge.
Okay, so international tension's definitely high. Let's pivot now, closer to home. Because June 20th saw some really significant things happening in U.S. domestic policy, too. Starting with a major Supreme Court ruling.
Mm-hmm.
On that day, The court further restricted abortion access. They upheld a state law banning most abortions after 6 weeks. And maybe the most controversial part, allowing private citizens to sue providers. Unsurprisingly, that sparked immediate widespread protests. But what are the deeper implications here beyond the initial reaction?
Well, it's not just the restriction itself, it's the mechanism, that citizen lawsuit angle. Legal experts were immediately saying, expect a wave of lawsuits, states, private groups testing the limits. This ruling doesn't just heat up the national debate, it signals a kind of calculated shift in legal tactics. It could empower similar citizen enforcement ideas for other contested rights, too. It really could reshape the civil liberties landscape.
And politically.
Oh, it's expected to be a massive factor in the 2026 midterms. It'll likely galvanize voters on both sides. And interestingly, international observers were watching closely, voicing concern that the U.S. seemed to be backing away from established human rights norms.
And incredibly, that wasn't the only major rights-related ruling from the Supreme Court that day.
No, it wasn't.
They also upheld Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming medical treatments for minors, reaffirming states' rights to regulate that kind of pediatric care. How did that land?
Intense reactions, deeply polarized. Advocates for trans youth called it punitive, medically unsound, potentially really harmful.
Right.
On the other side, those supporting the ban framed it as protecting children. So this ruling just pours more fuel on those really complex debates about medical ethics, parental rights, and that constant tug of war between federal and state power over fundamental rights.
Okay, let's look at the federal government itself. June 20th saw, well, a real mix. And environmental justice went on one hand, some highly controversial moves on the other.
Yeah, quite the contrast.
First, the win. A federal judge, Adam Abelson, actually blocked the EPA from cutting off those environmental justice grants funded by the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. He said the EPA hadn't given a good reason. Big victory for activists trying to help low-income communities of color hurt by pollution.
A significant check on administrative action there, yeah.
But then, the flip side. We learned the Trump administration's Department of Health and Human Services ordered the shutdown of the National Suicide Hotline specifically for LGBTQ plus youth. They just referred to LGBT plus youth services.
Which advocates immediately condemned, calling it a potential death sentence. Just devastating news for vulnerable young people.
Absolutely. And then, adding another layer, a report from Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee came out. It showed President Trump's recent pardons and clemencies let beneficiaries avoid over, $1.3 billion in fines and restitution?
That's the figure, yes. Mostly benefiting fraudsters, tax evaders, other white-collar offenders.
So what pattern do we see here? What does this say about government responsibility, accountability?
It really throws those debates into sharp relief, doesn't it? The EPA ruling shows the judiciary stepping in, demanding adherence to process. But the hotline shutdown and the pardon report raised serious concerns about executive decisions impacting vulnerable groups and, frankly, the financial integrity of the justice system. It's like seeing the checks and balances working in one case and raising alarms in others.
Let's zoom in on immigration now, also very active on June 20th. The Department of Homeland Security put out new rules. They now require 72 hours notice for Congress to inspect ICE detention facilities.
And crucially, it gives ICE discretion to just deny visits.
Right, which immediately got backlash, didn't it, from lawmakers, rights groups,
Yeah.
worried about transparency.
Exactly, especially with all the ongoing reports about overcrowding and poor conditions in those facilities. And then, adding to the tension, ICE carried out raids in Los Angeles County, arrested dozens.
Which led to big protests, clashes with police, tear gas even.
Yeah, things got very heated. It shows just how contentious these enforcement actions are. The LA Dodgers baseball team even pledged $1 million for legal aid for those affected.
Wow. But amidst all that, there was one individual case that stood out. Mahmoud Khalil, a Columbia University grad, a green card holder. He was released from an immigration jail in Louisiana after being held for over 3 months.
That followed a federal judge's order and a lot of public advocacy.
So what does his release, happening against the backdrop of the new rules and the LA raids, tell us?
It really underscores how vital due process and First Amendment rights are within the immigration system. It shows that judicial intervention and public pressure can make a difference, challenging administrative power and upholding individual rights, even in a system that's often criticized for lacking transparency and accountability. It's a small point of light, perhaps.
Finally, in the U.S. domestic scene, there was a clear sign of growing labor unrest. A strike by Safeway grocery workers spread across Colorado, but 1,000 employees walked out.
That's right. 10 stores and distribution centers affected.
What were they striking over?
Cuts to healthcare, retirement benefits, and also chronic understaffing, which is pretty striking when you hear that the parent company, Albertsons, reported nearly $1 billion in profit.
$1 billion.
Yeah.
While cutting benefits.
Exactly. And the CEO made over 15 million last year. So this strike really highlights that growing tension between corporate profits and what workers are actually getting. It mirrors broader labor movements pushing for fairer deals, especially with inflation being what it is.
Okay, shifting gears again, let's talk environment. The impact of climate change was brutally direct for millions on June 20th. This massive heat wave, a heat dome, as meteorologists called it,
Yeah, that was intense.
gripping the central and eastern U.S., somewhere between 100 and 200 million Americans under heat alerts, temperatures way over 100 Fahrenheit.
Which really strains the power grid and leads to a big spike in heat-related illnesses.
What's the bigger picture significance of an event like this happening so early in the season?
Well, it's a stark example, isn't it? A climate-driven public health threat right there. Meteorologists were very clear these heat domes, they're becoming more frequent specifically because of climate change. So it forces us to ask, how ready are we? Our infrastructure, our public health systems for these extreme events becoming, well, the new normal.
And it wasn't just the U.S., was it? Climate extremes were hitting elsewhere on June 20th, too.
No, absolutely not. You had Hurricane Eric in the Eastern Pacific, the earliest Category 4 hurricane ever recorded there. It hit southern Mexico hard. Widespread damage, sadly 19 reported deaths, 27 injured.
That's devastating.
And then severe floods in South Africa's Eastern Cape, at least 92 dead there, thousands displaced, infrastructure wrecked. It just highlights the escalating climate risks, especially in more vulnerable parts of the world.
And China, too.
Yeah, China's monsoon rains intensified, flood alerts across central and southern regions. Experts there were urging major investment in more resilient infrastructure.
So when you see all these extreme events happening simultaneously around the globe, what's the connection?
It paints a pretty clear picture of just how fast and widespread climate impacts are becoming. It really underscores the urgent need for both mitigation, cutting emissions, and adaptation, preparing for the changes already locked in, especially in those vulnerable areas. And it's relevant that June 20th is World Refugee Day. President Biden actually convened a major summit on climate and migration that day. NGOs, governments, UN agencies, all stressing that climate change is going to increasingly drive refugee flows, adding a whole new layer to humanitarian crises.
Wow. Okay, but amidst the grim climate news, there was one positive environmental story that day.
Yes, a significant win. The Conservation Fund finalized a $60 million purchase of land right next to the Okefenokee Swamp, which straddles Georgia and Florida.
And the impact of that.
It effectively stopped controversial plans for titanium mining right on the swamp's edge, which protects crucial water quality and preserves that incredibly valuable ecosystem. It's a great example of how targeted conservation can really make a difference against specific threats.
Good to hear a win. Now, turning quickly to tech and infrastructure. The FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, had a problem.
Yeah, a telecommunications outage at the Jacksonville Air Traffic Control Center caused a fair bit of disruption, delays, canceled flights in the southeastern U.S.
Prompting calls to modernize infrastructure, I imagine.
You bet. It really highlights how vulnerable even critical national systems can be to these localized tech failures, underscores that need for modernization.
And speaking of tech, regulators were looking at Tesla.
Right. The U.S. auto safety regulator started reviewing Tesla's responses about its plans to deploy robotaxis, basically trying to make sure they're meeting safety standards before unleashing them on the roads.
So increased scrutiny on autonomous tech.
Definitely. It signals that regulators are, prioritizing public safety as these new technologies try to go mainstream. They're being cautious but firm.
Okay, let's end this section on a really positive note. A major public health breakthrough. News came out about FDA approval for a powerful new HIV preventive vaccine.
This is huge, monumental, really, for public health.
What do we know about it?
The trials were incredibly successful, showed near elimination of transmission risk. This isn't just a medical milestone. It genuinely holds the promise of changing the entire course of the global HIV/AIDS epidemic, potentially saving millions of lives, drastically cutting transmission rates. Just incredible news.
That really is fantastic news to hear. And, reflecting on June 20th, it's also a reminder that alongside these huge global shifts and policy debates, just life happens.
Yeah.
Unpredictable moments. We saw two other distinct stories briefly. A deadly rock slide in Banff National Park in Canada, 2 confirmed deaths, 3 injured, immediately raises questions about safety in these beautiful but wild natural areas.
It's tragic.
And then in a completely different world, Sarah Burak, who was a star on that Netflix show Million Dollar Beach House, she was killed in the Hamptons. A suspected hit and run, police are investigating.
Yeah, just awful.
These events, sad as they are, they're also part of the fabric of what happens on any given day. So after walking through all of this,
Yeah.
what does it all mean for you, listening? We've just taken this deep dive into the sheer amount, the incredible variety of significant things unfolding on just one day, June 20th, 2025. You've got escalating global conflicts, critical policy changes, the undeniable effects of climate change hitting home, and, yes, even major public health breakthroughs. It's so clear the world just never stops moving.
And I think what's really striking is how understanding these individual pieces, even the ones that feel far away from your everyday life, helps build a much more informed view of the bigger picture, those larger interconnected forces shaping everything. This kind of knowledge helps you move beyond just reacting to headlines, you know? It helps you truly understand the context, the potential ripple effects, see the connections.
We really hope this deep dive has given you a fresh perspective, maybe some memorable facts to chew on.
And perhaps a final thought to leave you with. As these stories keep developing, how do you see these seemingly separate events, the conflicts, the court rulings, the climate impacts, the breakthroughs, how do you see them weaving together to shape our collective future? And what's your role in sorting out the signal from all the noise?